So welcome back everybody, and today we're at the launch of the Yamaha XSR125. Now I believe the European launch for this bike happened a couple of weeks ago in Amsterdam, but given the travel restrictions at the moment, the UK press were unable to attend. So today I'm in Northamptonshire, just outside Market Harbour. Not quite Amsterdam, but I'd argue the weather we've got today is more like a southern European vibe, so I'm looking forward to getting out on this bike for a nice sunny blast on some good country roads. But what's the big deal with it? Well, myself, I'm a big fan of retro motorcycles. I love the character, I love the styling, and in fact I've got my own, the Triumph Street Twin. But if you're a learner or someone looking for like an economical little city commuter, you're a bit limited for choice with the big name manufacturers. Take the Bonneville lineup for example, you know, they're 900 or 1200cc and they start from about 8 grand and up. Same for the bikes from America like the Indians and Harleys, and even from Japan we've got the Kawasaki Z900 RS and the Yamaha XSR700 and 900. So if you're after like a 125 with a bit of old school cool about it, I mean, you could look at the Honda CB125R, but that certainly operates at the more modern end of the retro spectrum, and so then it's down to the Chinese import 125s. And look, they're great value for money, but they're all built down to a price. So fortunately for 2021, we've now got the Yamaha XSR125. It's built upon a proven platform. It's the same engine and pretty much the same chassis as the R125 sports bike and the MT125 naked, but it does get that awesome styling from the bigger siblings in the XSR lineup. Now, of course, if you're going to go for an established brand like Yamaha, you can expect to pay a little more. So this bike comes in at around about 4.5 grand, and that's what I want to get to today. Is it worth the extra cash for a bike of this caliber? So here are the specs on this stylish little number. The 125cc 4-valve liquid-cooled single-cylinder engine, as we've already said, is carried over from Yamaha's other learner bikes. It makes the full 11 kilowatts or 14.7 horsepower permitted in the A1 license category. Now it's also Euro 5 compliant, and it makes use of their variable valve actuation system that they say ensures optimum power and torque for strong performance and lively acceleration. Around the engine there's a twin spar delta box frame which runs in a straight line from the swing arm pivot up to the steering head, and Yamaha claim this delivers optimum strength leading to precise and predictable handling. A 37mm upside down fork also helps, and there's a monoshock at the rear, although neither offers adjustability, not even preload on the shock. So if you plan on carrying a passenger on a regular basis, you might want to try it 2 up before you buy. It rolls on a pair of 17-inch wheels with some Scrambler-esque blocky tyres, and it gets a 110 at the front and a 140 at the rear, which is a touch wider than I was expecting, and it does contribute a bit of beefiness to the aesthetics. There's a single 2-pot brake on a 267mm disc at the front, a single pot on a 220mm disc at the rear, and you do get ABS on this bike, which is far preferable to the link braking systems that come on some of the cheaper 125s. Now that's really about it in terms of tech, as you don't really need all the traction control and riding modes at this level of power, but LED lighting front and rear and a neat LCD dash are worthwhile modern inclusions. Other than that, it's just worth touching on the styling and details, which really are up there with a larger capacity machine. It genuinely does look the part of a mini XSR, and there are plenty of finishing touches like the bench seat, painted mudguards and side panels, and the aluminium brackets on the subframe, headlight and front mudguard. It certainly has the attention to detail required to elevate it above the competition. But what's it actually like on the road? Well, we spent a good few hours blasting through the countryside, a couple of stops for photos, a bit of a break for lunch, and then back on the road for plenty of miles before the day was up. And after all that, this is what I thought of it. Honestly, really, it's quite difficult to find anything negative about this bike. It really does perform in pretty much every area, although you could argue that's not going to be a massive surprise. The R125, the MT125, they've already proven themselves, so it would have been a bit of a shock for this to be anything other than pretty accomplished on the road. So we'll start with the engine. I mean, you're limited to 15 horsepower in this category of bike, so it's never really going to be a big differentiating factor, but it does feel nice and smooth all the way up through the rev range. It doesn't get too vibey at the top, and it also pulls well at the bottom, I guess partly owing to the variable valve actuation. You've got a 6-speed box as well, so it can get up to like 75 and it feels pretty comfortable at 60. Clutch is nice and light, gearbox feels precise, snicks between the gears nicely, and I've also been pleasantly surprised by the suspension. Now I believe the fork is specific to this bike. The rear shock and the linkage, that's the same as the R125. Now there's no adjustability, but it is really nicely set up. It's not too crashy on rough road surfaces, but also it doesn't wallow around, it doesn't doesn't feel too squidgy. Braking is also really good as well. I know it doesn't look much on paper, a 2-pot caliper on a single disc, but you've got to remember it's not a heavy bike, and so there's plenty of power. And I was also getting really good feel through the lever. Honestly, the fundamentals of this bike are really spot on, but what's pleasantly surprised me about this bike is the riding position. It doesn't feel like a little toy bike. The seat height is actually fairly tall, the bars are nice and wide and they're sat up a little, and even though the foot peg position is very much that of a road bike, it does have the overall feel of a bit of a scrambler. So despite being a slender little bike, it actually has some of that big bike feel. Probably a really good option to look at if you're a taller learner, but also I think it's going to be pretty comfortable for most riders. And actually, these sorts of bikes, they do a lot of miles in the city, and you do want to be sat up looking over the traffic, and this has a great position for that. Now, this might not be on brand for Yamaha, and it might have something to do with the yellow and red paint jobs, but I'd say, and I mean this as a big compliment, that this essentially feels like a 125 Ducati Scrambler. Good components, good styling, doesn't take itself too seriously, and just has bags of that feel-good factor. I don't think any of us have got off the bike today without a big grin on our faces, and it's much more fun than it has any right to be. So it all sounds brilliant, but what about that price tag? 4.5 grand is certainly a good chunk more cash than some of the retro competition. The Herald Brat, for example, comes in at 3 grand, as does the McMongrel. The Brixton Cromwell at 2,800, the Sinis Hoodlum at 2,400. Now, most of these bikes keep the price down by building part or all of the bike in places like China or Korea, and then they import them under their own brand. Although I haven't ridden absolutely all of them, I've borrowed enough to be able to confidently say that there is a distinct difference in the build quality of the XSR. As you'd hope, it feels very much like one of their other bikes, only a little smaller. Everything feels much better finished, more durable, and more pleasing to use than pretty much all of the other 125s I've tested. There's also the engine. It feels smooth and refined, whereas others start to rattle and buzz, especially when you really start to push them, which is actually necessary on a pretty regular basis when you've only got 14 horsepower. And then there's the handling that you get from the decent suspension and the ABS. Now, this is a big one for me. Because the cheaper bikes are built to a price, they don't have ABS, and so by law it's required that both brakes can be operable with one control. This means that they link the front and rear brakes with what's normally the rear brake pedal. So while the front brake lever is still independent, if you panic and stamp on the pedal in an emergency stop situation, especially in the wet, chances are you're going to lock up the front because you don't get great feedback through a pair of boots like you do with the front brake lever on your fingers. No ABS to save you, so there's a good chance you'll be on your ass. On top of that, you can't learn to drag the rear brake for low speed maneuvers, and you can't learn to use it to smooth out the ride for when you're carrying a passenger. So if your ambition is to move up to big bikes and you want to use your time on a 125 to learn how to ride properly, then I'd be looking for a bike like this with independent braking. But ultimately, it really comes down to what you want it for. If you're just getting a 125 for a few months to get into biking, then you're going to move up to a bigger machine pretty quickly. I think you're still best off going for something used and flipping it on at the end. But if you want something you're going to hang on to for a while, something that you can be proud to own, something that should hold up to winter commuting, something that you can properly learn on, something stylish, and something that has enough performance to keep you properly entertained, then this will certainly fit the bill.